Hackney, we have the 11th highest level of unemployment in the country. So the test of this budget for ordinary people in Hackney, as is the test of this budget, I think, for ordinary people everywhere, is what will it do for unemployment? We are told that by this summer, the total of unemployed in the country as a whole will be the highest since records began 100 years ago. So if this budget doesn't meet the test of addressing the issue of unemployment, then this budget, I believe, will have failed. Now, of course, the Chancellor didn't ignore the subject. He revealed with a flourish a whole package of new schemes, which is supposed to be what this budget is going to do for the unemployed. And so what I wish to do is to examine these schemes and to see to what extent they offer substantial help for the unemployed and to what extent they're merely window dressing. There are 5 main schemes, some of them new, some of them beefed up versions of old schemes, that were revealed this afternoon. There's the Learning for Work, there's Community Action, there's an increase in the Business Startup Scheme, there's a new scheme called Tech Challenge, and there's also a proposal to give subsidies to employers on a pilot basis to employ the long-term unemployed. If we look at the Learning for Work scheme, this we are told, with enormous pride on the part of the Chancellor, will provide 30,000 places for the long-term unemployed to undertake a year's vocational training. Well, first of all, 30,000 places isn't that much. It's a handful per constituency. But more than that, these 30,000 places for year-long vocational training do not begin to meet the demand, which has got louder and louder in the months preceding the budget, that the government look again at the rule which says that you cannot study for more than 21 hours without losing benefit. It is, I think, heartless of the government to puff up these 30,000 places when there must be literally hundreds of thousands of unemployed people who would benefit from the range of training and education available in our institutes of learning, who are still going to be thwarted and are still going to have to face that if they go back to education, if they go into training, and if it's more than 21 hours long, they will lose their entitlement to benefit. And I think this rule is particularly heartless because in fact, whatever members opposite say, we are facing high unemployment in this country for some time to come. For weeks, the government has been giving hints and teasing people about the possibility of some flexibility on the 21-hour rule. And I think the Learning for Work scheme that we've been offered instead is a totally derisory response to a rule which continues to be unfair and continues to penalise unemployed people who genuinely want to retrain and improve their education. Let's look at the Community Action Scheme, which we're told will offer 60,000 places for unemployed people to do work in the community. Well, again, 60,000 places isn't very much compared to 3 million unemployed. But more than that, this scheme offers people a mere £10 on top of their benefit to go and engage in voluntary work. Ministers ought to stop and think. £10 a week won't even pay people's fares and their lunch money, and it certainly won't help the female unemployed with childcare or creche costs. So community action is crippled from the start in that it will not meet the needs of female unemployed with children, and certainly in London and the South East, the extra £10 will not make it practical or feasible for people to think of voluntary work in many cases because they simply won't be able to manage their fares, their meals, and possibly the new clothing that they'll need to go and do the voluntary work. And I noticed that this community action scheme is supposed to be delivered through the voluntary sector. That self-same voluntary sector which the government has decimated through years of cuts to local authorities. The other scheme, which was part of this glorious package, was the business startup scheme. We're told there were going to be 10,000 more places on the business startup scheme. What ministers don't mention is that of the businesses started under the business startup scheme, after 3 years, only 58% of them are going. After 4 years, I dare say the proportion is even lower. The other scheme, brand new scheme the government has launched, is the Tech Challenge scheme, which will involve training and employment councils across the country bidding for money from I think it's a central pool of money for job creation schemes. And these job creation schemes will be judged on the extent to which they involve the private sector. It seems to me the government has no idea about the reality of life in our inner cities. If you look at areas like Hackney and inner London and areas like Manchester and Birmingham, the private sector is virtually atrophied. The largest single employer in Hackney is the local authority, and following that, the health service. Well, members opposite sneer, but schemes which depend too heavily on the involvement of the private sector necessarily discriminate against residents of the inner city.
Will my honourable friend give way?
Of course.
Is it not a fact in constituencies like my honourable friends, what's been slashed in the urban programme will have a bigger impact on loss of jobs than what's been created within the budget proposals that we've got today?
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for that very important point. And to return to members opposite who jeered at the notion that local authorities are major employers in areas like Hackney, it is not the fault of the people in Hackney that traditional areas of employment, small businesses related to the docks and so on, have declined since the war. It is not the structural changes of employment in the inner city are not the fault of the inhabitants, and they ought to be able to look to the government to understand the structural changes of employment in the inner city and tailor job creation schemes to those structural changes, and not sneer as if the preponderance of workers in the local authority is by choice of the people in Hackney.
Perhaps outline to the House the measures which this glorious council in Hackney has taken to try and attract private enterprise back into her constituency, if any.
I know the honourable member is not familiar with the problems of the impoverished inner city, so I'll forgive him his ignorance. But I will tell him this, that Hackney Council has been chosen by the government to participate in the City Challenge scheme, and it is working very closely not with the private sector, because of course the private sector in Hackney is atrophied, but it's working very closely with housing associations and other voluntary organisations to help improve and renovate housing in Hackney. Hackney Council in 1993 is very keen to work with the private sector, but I ask the honourable gentleman any day of the week to come with me and walk up Kingsland High Street and walk up Stoke Newington High Street and go to the industrial estates on the edge of the Lee Valley and see what has happened to industry and business in Hackney under this government. The last major employer in Hackney closed down 4 or 5 years ago, and it doesn't suit a government which has done so much to smash manufacturing in areas like London and the South East, to sneer at the people of Hackney because they are perhaps more reliant than they would like on the local authority as an employer. But to go back to the government's much touted package of scheme. The final scheme is the notion of subsidising employers to take on the long-term unemployed. I mean, we should have to see how it works. I wouldn't wish to knock it before it's even got off the ground. But let me say this about these package of schemes. There's a sense in which these schemes are particularly heartless. They're particularly heartless because they're promoted as a realistic answer to the problems of unemployment. And yet, first of all, we hear today that even in the borough of Hackney, For every job vacancy in Hackney, there are 58 people chasing that job vacancy. And that's not particularly high. In other boroughs of London, particularly the outer boroughs, the numbers of people chasing each job vacancy is even higher. And I think it's particularly heartless to promote these schemes and publicise these schemes and carry on as if it's only a lack of will or ability on behalf of the unemployed which is stopping them working, when the fact is, if the jobs aren't there, and for 57 out of every 58 people in my constituency, the jobs aren't there, the most wonderful schemes in the world will not put people back into unemployment. And the other thing to say about these schemes is this. It's very interesting listening to the Chancellor's speech every year, but if you want to know the truth of what he's saying, you always have to look at the Red Book. And when you look at the Red Book, and you see how much is going to go into these schemes in the coming year, this package of these particular schemes is only going to be the equivalent of £55 million worth of expenditure in 93-94. I say that's a derisory sum to spend on unemployment in 93-94. I realise it's not the entirety of government spending, but it's the entirety of spending on these particular schemes that I have mentioned. And as I say, as we approach a summer, well, there will be more unemployed people in this country than there have been since records began. I think this is a particularly derisory and heartless response. I would argue that these schemes are window dressing. They are Mickey Mouse schemes which offer the shadow of hope to the unemployed, but don't begin to meet the reality of the unemployment crisis facing people in Hackney, in London and the South East, and internationally. And I'm afraid it is hard to escape the conclusion that what the government is really interested in is forcing people back into the labour market at the lowest wages possible. The government, now at least, talks about putting people back to work, but it acts in such a way as to promote a low-wage economy. And I wouldn't be so enthusiastic, if I were the government, to boast, as they are reduced to boasting now, about the amount of inward investment this country is getting. Because the basis for the inward investment this country is getting is partly the fact that we speak English here. And that's got absolutely nothing to do with government policy. But it's also the fact that wages in this country are 44% of the wages in Germany. And I do not believe that it can be a sustainable basis for growth and a return to full employment on this country to base our competitive edge on low wages rather than skills and training and education. It cannot be in the long term a viable course for this country to seek to compete on low wages and poor conditions rather than to seek to compete on education and training. And that's why it's particularly regrettable that the government did not see fit to re-examine the 21-hour rule for people on benefit, which stops them going into full-time education and training. So as I said earlier, if you want to look at the truth of any Chancellor's budget statement, you have to look at the Red Book. And what does the Red Book say about unemployment? Forget these window dressing things. What does the Red Book say? The Red Book says it will be some time before unemployment starts to fall again. What does the government's panel of advisors, the 7 wise men, say about unemployment? They are prophesying that unemployment will continue to rise and that by the end of the year, unemployment will be anywhere between 3.1 million and 3.4 million. This budget offers nothing for the unemployed in the short term apart from window dressing. The government knows this, and I believe the presentation of this budget and the actuality of this budget is particularly heartless and doesn't begin to meet the concerns of ordinary people in Hackney and in the country as a whole. But I want to turn now to a specific aspect of unemployment, which I'm sad to say I don't suppose will be raised in the entire 5 days of this debate, and that's the issue of black unemployment. Now, members may or may not be aware that recent research has shown that black unemployment is twice as high as white unemployment in this country. In my own constituency, the unemployment rate amongst young black males is as high as 1 in 2. And these very frightening figures for black unemployment are a particular tragedy for the black community, because the generation of black people that came here from the Indian subcontinent, from the Caribbean, and across the old Commonwealth, that generation that came in 50s and 60s, came here specifically to work. And it's a tragedy for the black community that their children and their grandchildren are on the economic scrap heap. Now, I believe there are particular factors that are affecting black unemployment in this country. First of all, there's a shakeout of labour in the public services, in health and in transport, which have traditionally been high employers of black and ethnic minority people. I also believe that black people are affected by discrimination. I also believe that black people are affected by what the Americans call last to be hired, first to be fired. I think the loss of jobs in local government is also particularly affecting black people who, at least in local government, certainly in our big cities, had a choice of fair employment opportunities. And what is the government doing about unemployment in general and black unemployment in particular? It's doing nothing. The government talks a lot about employer-based training. The problem with employer-based training schemes, that statistics prove that they discriminate against black and ethnic minority trainees. It seems to me cruel for the Prime Minister to talk about a nation at ease with itself, where you have a government which is prepared to see unemployment rip and prepared to see unemployment particularly bear most heavily on some of the most vulnerable sections of the community. I think that what the black community is demanding from this government, as with the rest of the community, is action on unemployment, action to move towards full employment, but specifically, the black community would like to see the government itself show a lead in being an equal opportunity employer, to make sure that its training schemes do not discriminate and are equally accessible to white and black trainees, and to show some concern in trying to support and devise specific schemes to address the issue of black youth unemployment in the inner city. I put it to this House, and I know not many people are concerned, but I put it to this House that black workers from all over the Commonwealth, helped to rebuild this country after the Second World War. And I believe that their children and grandchildren deserve better from this government than the studied indifference that they've had in the past years. And now I want to turn to a specific effect of unemployment, and that's the effect of unemployment on the housing market in the South East. Because let me say to the members opposite, there can be no return to business confidence in London and the South East without a revival in the housing market. I cannot talk about the particular conditions of the North or Wales and Scotland, but I do know that it was the rise in the housing market and that helped to promote a feeling of boom condition in the late 80s in London and the South East. It may have been an unrealistic sense of a boom, but a sense of a boom it was, and you won't get a revival in confidence unless the government does something about the housing market. And we see today that the bankers Morgan Grenfell have issued a report pointing out what those of us that are homeowners and live in London know, that house prices in London fell 25% in the past 4 years, and that the council tax is going to depress house prices in London even further. There are more people in London living in houses which are worth less than their mortgage than anywhere else in the country. And the stamp duty changes will do little to help homeowners in London and the South East, because you don't get much in inner London for £60,000, and 60,000 is the top limit of the people the stamp duty changes will help. Unless you have a revival of confidence in London and the South East about people's chances of staying in their jobs and getting a job, I do not believe that the housing market in London will start to move again. But finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, I want to return to my own constituency. Even on the government's own figures, which as we know have been adjusted and massaged to put the best possible face on the reality, we have over 10,000 unemployed people in Hackney. 1 in 4 males are unemployed, and nearly 1 in 5 women are unemployed. And what is worse, that there is a falling participation of unskilled people in the labour market. In other words, unskilled people are just not even bothering to register as unemployed. And the cuts in the local authority and the health authority, which will happen this year as a direct result of government policy, is going to make unemployment in Hackney even worse. Because as I said earlier, in inner city areas, the local authority and the health authority are major employers. What people in Hackney want, as I suspect people all over the country want, is a return to full employment. When I was a sixth former, nearly 20 years ago, and we were young people of 16 or 17 thinking about leaving school or thinking of going on to further education, what we discussed, what we thought about, what we talked about was what job will we do? It never occurred to people leaving school in the late 60s and early 70s that they wouldn't work at all. And I think that one of the harshest results of this government's mismanagement of the economy over the past decade is a whole generation of children leaving school in Hackney and all over the country who feel they may never work, that it's not worth, education isn't worthwhile, that training isn't worthwhile because the jobs aren't there. And I believe to blight the hopes of a generation in this way is one of the cruelest things that this government has done. It is all very well now for members opposite to weep crocodile tears about the unemployed, but people know they are indeed sniggering. This is the extent to which they're not really concerned. But what I'm saying is this, that it's all very well now, in the 90s, for members opposite to weep crocodile tears about the unemployed and to wring their hands in anguish over the issue. But members on this side and people out in the country know that throughout the 80s, this government deliberately used high unemployment as a weapon to smash the trade unions and to keep wages down. And nobody takes their crocodile tears seriously now. I said at the beginning of my remarks, the test of this budget for ordinary people, not the journalists, not the political professionals, but the test of this budget for ordinary people is what will it do about the central tragedy in economic life, the unemployed. I believe that this budget offers the unemployed Mickey Mouse schemes, window dressing, public relations schemes, but this budget is actually based, if you read the statistical and economic data behind the Chancellor's speech, this budget is actually based on an assumption that unemployment is going to rise and continue to rise and is not going to fall in the foreseeable future. Madam Deputy Speaker, I believe that this budget is a failure. It has failed my constituents, it has failed unemployed people in Hackney, it has failed unemployed people nationally, and I believe the country will see through this failure. And if this government has to go to the country in a few short years, the way it has cheated and deceived and failed the unemployed will not be forgotten or forgiven.
Yeah.